Today on Everyday Injustice, we have Santa Clara law professor David Ball. Welcome to our show.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and how you ended up at the law school?
Okay, I came, I think maybe relevant for your audience is that I did organizing as an undergrad. I was one of the sort of founders of the national part of what was called the Student Environmental Action Coalition, which was in the late 80s, early 90s. Unfortunately, it imploded right after I graduated, but that's a whole different story in terms of how one handles succession, especially if one is committed to sort of power sharing. You have to share power with people who are also committed to power sharing. Then I went to Oxford, and then when I came back to New York, I did a bunch of different things. I was an improvisational comedian and, actor and filmmaker. And then after 9/11 in New York, I did a lot of organizing in the Muslim community, of which I'm a member, sort of doing interfaith and intra-faith. One of the issues, or one of the opportunities, I guess I should say, in, sort of New York City is that, the Muslim population is incredibly ethnically diverse. And so that was sort of my background before we moved out here. And so we moved out here, and I went to law school because it was sort of my turn to pull the sled after my wife had done that. Those are improvisational comedian, you might be surprised to know, not a really lucrative career. I went to Stanford Law School, and when I got there, I really was taken with the sort of civil and human rights dimensions of mass incarceration. My wife is, she's a human rights lawyer. And so I sort of said, all right, well, you take the international, I'll take domestic. And so I really got very interested in that. And then my third year in law school, we had a visitor. Her name is Joan Petersilia. Unfortunately, she passed away a couple of years ago. But Joan was a criminologist who really worked on prisons and the effects of incarceration, which was novel at the time for a law school to have a criminologist. And it's also novel for law schools to have considered what happens after the sentence is issued. And so that really opened my eyes up to what I saw as being a topic that was not explored nearly enough in the legal academy. And there are lots and lots of other scholars who do that now, right? I mean, and who did that even then. So, there's Margot Schlanger at the University of Michigan Law School. There's Sharon Dolovich at the University at UCLA Law School. There's, my sort of co-chair for the ABA Corrections Committee at UC Irvine, Karamet Ryder. There are folks at Davis who do the same stuff. Jack Chin is, just my favorite, but, there are plenty of others. So, but that really was where I started being interested. And after I clerked, I worked for a year at the Stanford Criminal Justice Center as a fellow, really working on some projects that dealt with, data and operations integration in California. We have a bunch of different law enforcement agencies. We have 58 jails. Well, Alpine actually doesn't have their own jail, but we have more than 50 jails, jail systems, many more jails than that. And we didn't do a very good job of tracking, sort of why people enter the system, what we do to prevent them from re-entering the system, sort of any of these sort of very, very basic management kinds of things. And so that really was the start of, that's how I got into this line of work. But I mentioned the sort of organizing and the policy stuff because I've always seen that as being part of what I bring to the table as, sort of a law professor, is that I've got one foot in the policy world really coming at it as sort of an organizer who's interested in these kinds of things. And then my writing, sort of helps. That's my new puppy. Sorry about that. She's very tough on crime, which includes squirrels and everybody who walks past our house. And I have yet to enlighten her about that, but lots of people don't listen to me. So that's the real background of what has gotten me sort of where I am today, where I do policy. I'm really interested in trying to help change the world, help shrink, the footprint of mass incarceration in the state, locally, and nationally. But also the kinds of things that I write about and research are really, I hope, done with an eye toward, really helping people think of new solutions or, just intensely practical solutions. So.
One of the interesting things as I listen to you describe that is I've often thought that the world's kind of caught up to the space I was already inhabiting. And it sounds like the world is kind of caught up to the space that you've inhabited.
Yeah, I mean, I learned from a lot of other people, and it's funny, I think about this sometimes when I was actually just thinking about this today. I really like listening to music, and there are some, that music is this very human, where everyone is borrowing from everybody else. It's bad when it's exploitative, but like we are, we listen to each other, we're not that different from birds or other animals. And so I do, I know this is Dawkins' theory of the meme, but, I learned from a lot of people, and, in turn, I hope that, I've helped, some of them think about new things. And so I'm really pleased that this conversation has moved where it is moving. But I also think that I wouldn't necessarily say that I was, sort of standing apart and everybody caught up next to me, that I was sort of a part of an organism or a communication network that, where certain signals were getting amplified and that spills out. But I continue, I have to say, and to learn from so many people. And I think it's really important as an academic that you always talk to folks who are system impacted. And one of the ways I've gotten, most of my really good ideas is by talking to people and saying, I ask them 3 questions. What do you wish everybody knew, about what it's like to be, poor in San Jose, or a prisoner in, the California state prison system? What's one thing that you wish everybody knew? What's one thing that everybody thinks they know, but they misunderstand, right? So the common misunderstanding. And then what do you wish you knew? And so when you ask those questions, you get at least one person who's interested in the research that you're going to do at the end of it. So it's not just my long-suffering wife who has to read my article, but it's like, hey, that thing that you said you were interested in, here you go. So that again is, I think, a better way of dealing with it. All right, see if I can. Well, she's chewing on her bones, so sorry about that.
No problem. So can you talk about, what the Corrections Committee at the ABA is and what your role is?
Sure. So the American Bar Association is the largest association of American lawyers. And so I became the co-chair when I was invited by a woman named Giovanna Shea, who had written some stuff about prisons that I really liked. And then she moved off that to become, to work as a public defender in Hartford. She had a career change, so she was in Connecticut. And then I invited Karamet Ryder, who I mentioned, who is sort of a JD PhD, and she studies solitary confinement, just an amazing scholar and an activist. And so a lot of what the ABA does is it issues policies that are meant to sort of guide judiciaries, the federal government and state governments that say, well, this is what we think is in our considered judgment is the policies that you should enact. These are our principles, and what is helpful about the ABA is that it has, at least I'm most familiar with the criminal justice section, it has DAs and judges and public defenders. So it isn't, you are having to talk sort of across difference and reach some consensus on that. And so the issues that we've worked on, one of the issues that's really near and dear to me is prison phone calls Your audience might not know this, but even though almost everybody, or certainly everybody listening to this, has like at least 3 platforms that they can use to teleconference with someone for free, right? But a 20-minute video conferencing call can cost $30 from a local jail. And the reason is that there are site licenses, someone else might call them something else, where there's revenue sharing between the local government or the facility and the telecoms company that's offering that. So it is a revenue generator for these local prisons, local jails, and for state prison systems. And so we were saying that this is a bad idea for a variety of reasons. One, is it's among the most regressive taxes you can possibly imagine. People who are in prison are a lot less affluent and have less wealth, so lower income and lower wealth. But it's also bad policy because there's not necessarily a consensus on why we imprison, and there's not very good evidence in support of any of those reasons. But one of the things that we at least say is a goal of imprisonment is rehabilitation. And we also want to reduce recidivism, making sure people don't end up back in prisons and jails. And one of the most effective things you can do about that is to make sure that people have contacts with people who are not inside, who are on the outside, and they can start to sort of grease the skids a little bit to make sure that when they transition back out, they're like, I really miss my kids and I'm in their lives and I really want to turn this around for them. Or, I rekindled these other sort of what in the academic literature are called pro-social relationships, so folks who are not involved in, criminal activity. And the harder we make that, the more we say, well, the only people that and the only people you talk to and the only experiences that get represented are other folks who are in prisons and jails. And that's just a terrible way to do things. So it's bad economics. It's bad in terms of, we end up paying much more for recidivism than we could possibly hope to gather from, these sort of $15-20 phone calls. And it's cruel to the children, right, who lose access to their parents, right? For women, 80% of women prisoners in state prisons were the primary caregiver for their kids. About half of men have kids, right? They might not have relationships with them, but we want to encourage that. And the kids didn't do anything to have their parent go in there. So we want the kids to have, contact with them. So that was one that I was really proud of. It was very difficult to get that through when Ajit Pai was head of the FCC, which does, which regulates that. And, we've also done things about, restoring Pell Grants to prison university programs. So we issue these policies, and then it's really up to either members of the committee or other folks to say, hey, the ABA says we should do this. And that is persuasive, precisely because we have the buy-in of, DAs, public defenders and judges. It's not seen as being, just a sort of, Brookings or Pew or something like that. One of the, left-ish leaning, think tanks. It's seen as being like, well, this is sound policy. So that's a lot of the stuff that we do.
Well, and that's really interesting because, I have a lot of contact with people in prison, and one of the problems during COVID that a lot of people don't think about is they had for a good period of time their in-person visits shut down, so their only access to their family was over these video conferencing or a phone call. And it seems like it's gotten better, but GTL used to be really expensive.
Yeah. So, and this is one of those issues that there's not a lot of great news when you work in the prison field, but there are some things that really get your goat. And that's one of mine is that these are just so extortionate. Like nobody here has paid, that is listening to this, has paid probably, I'm old enough where I can remember where I'd be like, ooh, $1 a minute to call, Hawaii from Atlanta. But, people think that those days are long in the past. It's like, no, in some places calling 15 miles away is going to run you at least $1 a minute. And there's not There's no justification for that. And that really, yeah, it's horrifying. And, moreover, right, it's not even, so Charles Dickens came and he looked at, the penitentiaries in Philadelphia, in the early 1800s. And he said, wow, they don't, there was the sort of, the Philadelphia model was solitary confinement plus work, and the Auburn model was congregate labor, right? But labor was a very big part of how, at least the theory behind how we could make people, conform to, societal norms. And these dogs are just reminding me of, what happens without, they're in the state of nature. But when Dickens came, he said, wow, people go insane in these solitary confinement. And we've known that for at least, for almost 200 years. And when you think about COVID and no human contact, that was just that is a psychological harm, in addition to the fact that, COVID protocols were so limited in prisons and jails. My colleague Hadar Abiram at Hastings has written a lot about the ways in which prisons and jails were actually vectors for spreading COVID into the surrounding community. So everyone is downstream of everybody else. We are all connected, whether we like it or not.
Yeah, and I think we've learned a lot, but it always seems like, and I just finished reading the book Breaking the Pendulum, but it just seems like we've learned a lot, and yet we make the same mistakes over and over again when it comes to incarceration.
Well, the joke that I say to my students, and let me just be plain, I do not do sit-ups. If you could see my lower abdomen, you would know that. But it is the difference between the theory of sit-ups and doing sit-ups. You can read all you want about the theory of sit-ups. It's not going to make you stronger, right? So these are not problems of ideas a lot of times. They are problems of building that muscle. So can we actually get to the point where we say, yeah, we know this is not working. Let's actually try to build something else. Let's try to strengthen our muscles. Let's try to, work on our compassion. Let's try to envision something different. Instead, I think we go back to saying like, yeah, well, that would be a good idea, but we can't do that. And why is that? Well, because we haven't actually done that first. You got to start somewhere, right? And we have trouble sometimes doing that.
So I understand you also did some work on the Blue Ribbon panel on marijuana legalization. And, it's kind of interesting, you're probably slightly older than me, but, I was in high school in the 80s. And
I'm not older than you then. So I graduated high school in 88. So yeah.
Okay. So yeah, I graduated in 91.
Okay. Yeah.
So slightly.
Okay.
But
so slightly.
Bottom line is, we've come a long way, since that time when it seemed inconceivable that we would ever have legalization. How did you get involved in that issue?
So one of the classes that I teach is criminal procedure investigation, which is all about the Fourth Amendment and, and really the death of the Fourth Amendment, as far as I'm concerned, how little it protects you. And the burnt odor of marijuana has been used as either reasonable suspicion or probable cause to search people. That was a staple of law enforcement techniques. And I am somebody who thinks that, the government should, I think that the Fourth Amendment is great. And I think that, moreover, I think if you are an originalist, you understand that the sort of size and scope of the state in criminal justice is totally unprecedented for what we had, in 1789 when, the Bill of Rights was actually ratified. I don't think there's any question about that. Of course, it's complicated by the fact that, millions of people were enslaved and they had zero rights at all, so when we can complicate that, but my impulse was to say that if we take away sort of marijuana as a tool that can be used to stop and frisk people, to search their cars, things like that, that is going to shift the power balance in terms of what law enforcement's relationship with the citizenry. Now, I wasn't one of those folks who thought, well, everybody in California prisons is there because of, marijuana possession. Like, we actually, at the time of Prop 64, there were very, very, very few people serving any kind of long sentence for any kind of marijuana, let alone possession. That is not true in states like Louisiana, where there are people who are serving long sentences for simple possession of marijuana, right? But that's not, the story that you sometimes hear, where it's like, you could let out every single marijuana offender in the United States, and we would still have racially skewed and we'd still be the number one incarcerator, right, in the world. So that's not what's driving it. But what I think is important to remember is that something short of prison actually does have an effect on people's lives. So the studies are pretty good in suggesting that youth who are adjudicated as juvenile delinquents actually sort of grow into that label. So any contact with the criminal legal system, and it's not the criminal system when you're a juvenile, it's this weird, it's what would be a crime if you were an adult. And, so the juvenile justice system is its own strange hydra. But even being arrested, right? Consider that if you are, somebody who is likely to be arrested for marijuana possession, right? We know those are very racially skewed. There's a landmark study by the ACLU is sort of 8-to-1 in places like Minneapolis, and it's about 3.5 to 4-to-1 nationwide, right? So there's a legitimacy problem there. Who gets arrested? White people and Black people, and this was the study, was people of African descent, people of European descent, smoke pot at roughly the same rates, and yet the arrest rates are very different. Maybe there is something about where people smoke pot, but there's not really any compelling evidence about that, it's not like, African-American people are lighting up on the steps of the police department and, white people are doing it like in an underground bunker that nobody can reach, right? So I think there is an equity part there, because even being arrested, right? If you're an at-will employee, and you can't make bail, right? You're going to end up being in jail for a long time. Like, there are significant costs even to being arrested.
An access point to the police, because, if you're somebody sitting on the street smoking a joint, then all of a sudden they can approach you. And so even if they don't do anything about the marijuana, maybe they find something else on you.
Yeah. And that was really my thought, right? Is to say, okay, and the other thing is that, so I actually am kind of idiosyncratic about this. I say it's civil regulation of cannabis consumption rather than criminal regulation of cannabis consumption. And because that's the way we were treating it, right? It's not like when we say legalization, there's still limits. Like, you can't drink and drive either, right? You can't be 16 and drink alcohol. And so alcohol consumption is regulated. Alcohol distribution is regulated. I can't make distilled spirits and sell them, right? So it's the question of, should this be a matter where we are enforcing what we see as being beneficial rules, and we can set aside whether or not the rules that we ended up with are beneficial at all, but who should be in charge of enforcing those? And the question is, who's getting better if we, who's being served by saying, well, we're going to actually send you to jail, rather than we're going to fine you, or we're going to re-educate you, or we're going to take away your license, or those kinds of things. So that was really it, is that I didn't see, there's no evidence that the criminal regulation of cannabis worked. And the joke that I always have with my students, I mean, each year it gets worse, it gets less funny, but I'm like, well, for those of you who are in California, pre-Prop 64, you remember that nobody in your high school ever smoked pot because, it was illegal, right? Which is, of course, a total joke, because it didn't do anything about it just meant that you were more likely to get adulterated products and, all sorts of other things where, I don't think that young people should smoke pot. I don't think it's good for your brain. I mean, it's not a vegetable, right? It's not, I don't think you should drink either. I don't think you should, do tobacco, but I understand people do, and you shouldn't be kicked out of high school for that. And there should be other ways of reaching you other than saying like, well, here you go, welcome to the system. We really want to lift you up, not sort of shut you out.
So I want to shift gears. Another interesting issue, and I've actually been down in Santa Clara at the old jail covering this issue. Yeah, so there's proposal for new jail. Your thoughts on that?
So I want to lift up, there are lots of grassroots groups that are working on this. And the one I know best is Silicon Valley Debug, which is the executive director is a guy named Raj Devayadev, who's awesome. And Raj is actually one of those people where, when I finally met him in person, I was like, anything you want, like if there's any research I can do, please let me know, right? So things that he's like, well, I think this is it, can you find, some stuff, or this is our lived experience, what does the research say? And I think that that's really helpful, right? I mean, that's sort of my orientation. So, it came to my attention that there was this existing campaign. So I joined an existing campaign led by Silicon Valley Debug and lots of other grassroots groups. But what I wanted to do was, so it was just law professors who worked in Santa Clara County for us to say, what really is this the best we can do? Now, I understand that the existing jail has lots of problems, right? And so there is this sort of prisoner welfare component to it that says, yeah, if we have jails, they need to actually be up to code. But, my late professor, Joan Petersilia, who was a dear mentor of mine, what she would always tell us in class, and this is, sort of received wisdom in criminology, is build it, fill it, right? So if you build a carceral facility, you can't really repurpose it to do anything else with it, right? I mean, that's a real problem. And the sort of, when we went through our prison building boom in California, where we built 20 prisons in 21 years, we only really accounted for the cost of building. The way we floated bonds is they were supposed to be revenue bonds, and nobody's making money out of prisons, right? I mean, it was a very, shell gamey kind of thing. But, so even when we talk about the cost, so the Santa Clara County Jail, the new jail, is supposed to be about $390 million. But that's the cost of the building, maintenance, operations, staffing, all those things are going to be more, right? And this is not, contrary to, all the bond measures that were floated under Duke Majan, this is not an investment that yields any results. This is often what you see in like small towns who are like, we're going to get a prison here and we're going to build around that. Nobody wants, like Soledad, nobody wants to go there because it's like, what do you know about Soledad? It's a prison, so it's not like everyone's like, yay, I want to raise my family near prison. There aren't ancillary, kinds of, it's not like Silicon Valley, right? And so the campaign that Debug had and with their coalition partners was to say, let's invest this in more what are sometimes called front end issues, right? So thinking about, why do people end up in the criminal legal system? What is going on with them? Well, for a lot of them in California in particular, right, it's being unhoused. You can go to the bathroom. That's against the law because it's in public, right? And it's, it's a function, loitering, trespassing, all those things. There are folks who are traumatized, who end up self-medicating with alcohol and other drugs. That's the whole adverse childhood experiences, which Nadine Burke-Harris, our California Surgeon General, has talked so eloquently about, right? And so, and then, I think there's also sort of a trauma or under-policing problem. You often hear people say this, that we have over-policing on sort of quality of life stuff, and under policing when it comes to real violence, right? So the murder clearance rate, and the clearance rate is just arrest in, sort of more marginalized communities. And when I say marginalized, I mean either poorer or not white, right? So politically marginalized. The clearance rates there are less than 50% often, right? So in Brentwood, LA, where rich folks live, clearance rate is in the 60s or 70s. But in sort of South Central Los Angeles, it's much lower than that. And so those are three things that I would really focus on, right? Is to say, like, well, how do we do violence interruption? How do we sort of, and some of that is also due to trauma, right? And but how do we deal with the root causes of drug usage or mental health problems, right? Mental health is not always, we always have this sort of linkage of mental health with violence. And I think it's a really pernicious thing. I'm not trying to say that, but I do think that mental health and sort of problematic usage relationships with substances is real. And then there's being unhoused. And so the campaign said, why are we not spending, this $400 million on that? We would get a lot more investment. We would get a lot more bang for our buck for that, right? Because everybody who is, sort of suffering from trauma and who has an unhealthy relation, some form of substance use disorder, is not living their best lives. And, that's not a flourishing society. And yes, we should treat people who are in the criminal legal system with dignity, and they should have a safe place to live. But we should look and see, like, are we guaranteeing that, or what are we doing to make sure that happens to people when they're 5, 6, 7, when they're 20, when they're 80, when they're 90, and they're not in jail? Like, let's think about how people are housed and how they are treated outside of jail, and invest the money there in addition to, the jail. So that's really what, and that's what, our letter said. And our letter does acknowledge, and I think it is important to acknowledge, that our existing facilities are bad, but also trying to think about how would we imagine, ultimately reducing our reliance on jails. What do we think jails do? What is our evidence in support of that? And you'll find, ironically, that the cupboard is a little bare when we have a theory of, like, how do prisons make people better? How do prisons work on incapacitation? How do prisons work in terms of sending a retributive message to people? Those are all the supposed justifications for imprisonment, and there's not a whole lot of evidence in support of that.
Yeah, and I think this goes to kind of maybe my final question here, which is, how do we I'm not an abolitionist, but I'm kind of a minimalist when it comes to incarceration. I think we incarcerate way too many people for bad reasons. And, there are clearly people that need to be incarcerated because they're a danger to society and themselves. But I think that number is actually pretty small, right, at least as a percentage. So how do we get from, this kind of massive carceral system to a point where it kind of makes sense, but, it doesn't drive people's fear that crime's going to explode?
So one thing for me is always, sort of looking at history. And when Ronald Reagan was governor of California, the prison population declined, right? And it was possible then for a conservative governor to speak about things differently, and I think that would be a surprise to a lot of people, right? So that's one thing that I'm always interested in. But the other thing, so my most recent article actually does address this. It is called The Peter Parker Problem, and yes, it's about Spider-Man. And the thinking was that I was having lots of conversations with people when I was working on bail reform, sort of pretrial population reduction, that people would always say, well, if I let this guy out, what if he does something bad, right? And Peter Parker, for you and your audience who don't know, right? Like, before he's Spider-Man, he sees a guy running down the hallway, and the policeman asks him to stop him, and Peter's like, it's not my deal. right? And then later his beloved Uncle Ben gets killed, and it's the same guy he could have stopped, and his regret, and like we feel terrible for Peter, right? And the reason why I use this is because it's cartoonish, but it works, right? It works. We're like, man, I would never do that. And so we think about the one person who might fail. Everybody, or I would imagine that a large number of folks in your audience would know who Willie Horton is. He was one of only 2 people who failed on the furlough program that Governor Michael Dukakis, had in 1987. 2 people. It was 99% successful. And it was 50 years ago. And if there were lots of Willie Hortons, we'd hear there'd be somebody's name besides Willie Horton. And so it's so persuasive to us that we're like, we can never let that happen, that we ignore the fact that that there are real costs to people who are involved in the system. So if you take bail, right, you're not convicted of anything. But if you are cooling your heels in jail because one person might do something, and so 99 people are kept in jail, we need to count those costs. We need to move those costs, those system costs, to the forefront of our mind and say to ourselves, how are we thinking about this? Are we thinking about this the way we think about plane crashes, which are far more rare than automobile crashes, right? We live with the fact that driving is dangerous. We live with the fact that tens of thousands of people die in car accidents because we know that there is utility and benefit to driving. And there is utility and benefit to not having people in jail. And the cost is occasionally there is a sensational crime, but we don't know who's going to commit those crimes. We can't judge with any certainty who it's going to be. And so we have to prioritize. I think that, so I would say, getting back to my original point about history, the context here is that the United States incarcerates more people than any other human society at any point in human history. And so either we have something figured out that no one else has, and we are at the pinnacle of, human development, or we are an outlier. And I think it's way more likely that we're an outlier and we're getting something wrong than that every other human who ever lived got it wrong. And so once we understand that, then we can say it is, there's no question. I had a very good friend who was murdered right after college. That was terrible. It's a terrible, terrible thing when somebody you love dies. It's a terrible thing when somebody you love gets assaulted. It's a terrible thing. So I understand that. But I'm not looking to incarcerate, 1,000 people because my friend, was killed. It was a murder-suicide. It was horrible. I don't know. That's not going to bring her back. Her name was Erica Kurtz. May she rest in peace. That's not going to bring her back. And I think that that's a really bitter pill to swallow, that terrible things happen. I get the human impulse to say, let's do anything we can to avoid that kind of pain. But we are causing pain in the meantime. And we are causing pain in terms of pretrial, to people's families, right? We're making them poor. They might lose their primary breadwinner. They might become homeless as a result. Kids lose access to their folks, who are behind bars. It's really, really disruptive. And I think that we need to get beyond that sort of cartoonish Peter Parker mindset of like, well, next Willie Horton got to avoid that, and really stop and slow our minds down and say, actually, that's not the way it works. And when I say slow our minds down, there's the Thinking Fast and Slow, the Daniel Kahneman book that talks about, sort of our fast minds that jump to conclusions and our slower minds that allow us to think that out. So that's the best I can offer there. But it's going to take lots and lots of conversations like this one and many others for us to figure out, like, who are we as a society, and how seriously do we take the lives of people who are system impacted as well as outside?
Yeah, and what you were talking about, especially, with pretrial and what happens if you release the wrong person, is exactly a conversation I had with Chesa Bodine, the San Francisco DA, right after he got elected. I asked him, what his biggest concern is, and his biggest concern is, if we do bail reform, what happens if we release somebody who does something awful? And
Right.
sure enough, one of the reasons he's in hot water is the McAllister case, where the guy was released and ends up hitting and killing two people on a sidewalk in a stolen car. And sure enough, that becomes, the poster case for his recall. And so, you could think of that as the modern day Willie Horton. There, 99 out of 100 people probably have been released and had no problems, but the
Right.
one person that doesn't becomes the reason to remove this guy from office.
Right. It's an indictment of the system. And I think that, one of the other problems that we have in the criminal legal system is that we have cases that have system impacts, but they're not necessarily considered. Right. So I think if judges were, if we had a different system, judges are like, okay, here are 100 people, you 10 are the most dangerous. Right. The other 90 of you go free. But instead, it's one by one. Well, this guy could be one of the 10 most dangerous. And so lo and behold, at the end of 100 people, you're like 100% of them are in the 10% most dangerous category, rather than saying, oh, I'm going to look at you comparatively. Right. And so I'll just say one other thing. I know we're running up against time is, one of the things that I have thought would be helpful are system constraints. And so I think that we should not have any county in this state where there are more jail beds than there are mental health and drug treatment beds. And I know that there are problems with compulsory mental health. I saw One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest like everybody else. And, I understand that the way in which, there are compulsory aspects to drug treatment. But nevertheless, I also know that we hear reports from time to time in the state where the judge says, Humphrey is one example, Henry Humphrey, the California bail case, where somebody is qualified for and could go to drug treatment, but there isn't space. And so they go to jail. So everyone has said, this is what you need, but we don't have it. But we always have room at the jail, right? Same with mental health. There have been some Bay Area counties recently that have gotten in trouble for that, where it's like, well, you need mental health treatment, but all we have is jail, which is a terrible place to go for somebody who, has psychosis or, schizophrenia or any of those things. And so I think if we said, well, let's make sure, and this gets back to sort of my conversation about the building the jail in Santa Clara County, right? We need to actually fund our values. Budgets are moral documents. That's what the Poor People's Campaign and a lot of the Black Lives Matter work has come around to, and I've learned a lot from them, right? Is to say, well, where are the resources? There seem always to be resources for jail and prison, and stuff like schools and poison control centers and things like that. That's optional, and I don't think that's right. So that's something that if we're going to have beds to incapacitate people while they work on their stuff, it should be that we have at least as many drug treatment beds as jail beds, and at least as many mental health treatment beds as jail beds, because otherwise jail becomes the de facto treatment for that, and that doesn't work for anybody. It doesn't work for people who are awaiting pretrial, who have to deal with somebody who's having a mental health crisis. It's scary if you're not a trained person, sometimes actually even scary if you are a trained person, right? It's scary to witness somebody going through withdrawal, right? People die because they don't have, access to, if their bodies have become accustomed to opiates, right? So all of those things where I want to say, let's actually figure out what we need and let's put some money behind that.
Well, we are out of time. Thank you for coming on and sharing your experience. Been very enlightening to hear your thoughts. David Ball, who is a law professor at Santa Clara. This has been Everyday Injustice. I'm your host, David Greenwald. Join us again next time for more tales from the injustice system.